My name is Tethered. I'm the director of the Donia Human Rights Center. And today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Shareen Hertel. She's professor of political science at the University of Connecticut. She's also a long-standing member of the UConn's Human Rights Institute, known as, for my money, probably the best human rights center institute in the United States. She's also on the President's Committee on Corporate Social Responsibility at UConn, which is an equivalent of our President's Advisory Committee on Labor Standards and Human Rights, at which she gave a talk at noon today, a presentation. I've been keeping her busy today. She gave that talk at noon, then she came to my class at 2:30. Now she's here to give a lecture on her book. She brings long years of experience in the practitioner's world and the scholarly world. She knows both worlds very well, worked at the United Nations, NGOs, did research on the ground in India, Bangladesh, Mexico, and many other places. And she is one of the leading scholars of human rights, period, and especially in the areas of economic and social rights. I can't think of anybody that I would count on for any knowledge, information, expertise in those areas. So it's a pleasure to welcome her. And she has published at least four books and a number of articles. And she's here to talk about her most recent publication, Tethered Fates, which came out last year, I believe, right? Pretty recently. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Hertel.
Thank you, and thank you. I should just stop now, because with such a beautiful introduction, I don't need to say anything further. But it is a joy, and I want to especially acknowledge also Brenna and Ariella and colleagues who have made this stay seamless, amazingly well prepared. And thank you to the committee and all of you who do this hard work of translating what we mean by human rights into practice on a daily basis at this university. I think that one of the things I want to start with in my talk is the idea that stakeholders, all of us in this room are stakeholders affected by corporate activity. We're affected by business activity whether we own stock or are employed by an enterprise or not. Today I'm going to talk to you about people who live in communities impacted in the production of collegiate apparel. So the Gold blue shirts I see everywhere, or my Husky Dog apparel. But I'm going to step back from those case studies, which are central to the book, and also give us a sense of what we mean by stakeholder engagement in business and human rights as a term, where in the world, if at all, it's happening, across what regions of the world and what industries. How do local people perceive this phenomenon of business and human rights, and in particular this notion of remedy for human rights? And then what are the implications of somewhat of a disconnect between the way we have begun to address this normative push for corporate responsibility and the local level dynamics in communities at the end of the supply chain? There are shifting incentives for both business and government and civil society, all of us, to engage with these issues. We know, and I spoke today with your committee on labor rights, but there's an extraordinary amount of work happening here on your own campus around sustainability of the food system and carbon neutrality. So the increasing fragility of common pool resources, air, water, et cetera, push these conversations to the forefront. The instability systematically in both political and social stressors, I don't have to tell you, but Q and I have been talking back and forth all day about the degree to which disease or public health can really impact social and economic choices. Growing inequality globally. I grew up in Michigan and I was born in '66, so sort of at the moment at which Detroit was going to start burning, and then the crash and tanking of the auto industry, and it's very wonderful to be back. I have many friends and relatives here, but I haven't lived here since the early 1980s, and so watching inequality take off in microcosm in the place I grew up, but globally, is a real stressor and push for this kind of stakeholder engagement. And then the challenge of brokering dialogue with and amongst stakeholders at the community level is beset by just the real challenge of collective action. We see it in our current political climate in the United States, but getting people of goodwill to communicate even across political divides or elsewhere to address these kinds of challenges is a really significant impediment to doing more around business and human rights. Finally, for businesses, and I'm not a business school professor, but I know there are a number in the room, these issues are incredibly important, and they are for labor unions and they are for working people, because brand reputation and innovation is shaped because of these larger systemic constraints. And so the work I'm going to do today in talking about the book is to think about whether stakeholder dialogue, whether engagement with people beyond workers can lead to remedy for economic rights violations that are experienced by people at the community level in the light manufacturing sector. All those Emgo blue shirts, all of my Yukon apparel is made in light manufacturing. And so I'm going to focus on the sector I know best, but I know there are colleagues here who work on extractive industries, and so I'm going to talk a bit as well about juxtaposing what happens in light industry with what happens in other industries. And I want to make sure that I think through with you, and let me just make sure that this is going to move, what economic rights are. Since Keo was kind enough to say I've been helping shape that field, let me just put on the table what I mean by economic rights. They are the poor stepsister of human rights in US political human rights discourse. We've tended to focus a lot in the United States on civil and political rights, the right not to be tortured, the right to vote, the right to non-discrimination. But economic rights include three parts: the right to basic subsistence, the right to work, both equal access to work and decent treatment at work, and the right to basic income guarantees for people who cannot work, unemployment insurance, sickness pay, social safety nets broadly. And that bundle is what we mean by economic rights. And so the puzzle, can this stakeholder dialogue, can the emergence of these new norms around business and human rights actually meaningfully impact the lives of people impacted by light manufacturing globally or not? Tethered Fates explores a number of things. First, this new norm. I'm a political scientist, and we're very interested in the kind of juncture between international relations theory and comparative politics and how norms shape action. So we have a remedy for people harmed in the course of business activity. The notion of remedy is an emergent norm in this field of business and human rights. I'm going to look at a mechanism. I'm a very mechanism-driven political scientist. I'm really interested in what makes people tick and how we repeat those kinds of human interactions over time. So consultation as a key mechanism, both for preempting harm and then providing redress and remedy when harm occurs. And finally, I'm going to identify, and I'm going to show you how the research design of the book helps us do that, what is the current state of the art in this area of business and human rights and consultation. It's a very, I'm going to argue, top-down process, largely driven by companies. And I'm going to look at how we might shift the form and the content of how we consult to be more inclusive and to integrate community benefit as a cost of doing business. How might we really rethink what we mean by remedy if we consult with people at the local level beyond the workforce itself? Okay? All right. So I'm going to talk about this norm very quickly. Just like I laid out what an economic right is, let me explain what I mean in international human rights terms by this norm of remedy. John Ruggie is the person who really put this norm on the table. He's the special representative of the Secretary General on Business and Human Rights for many years. I have a personal connection to him only because I was a grad student at Columbia at different points, and he was our dean of the School of International Affairs, but he kind of abandoned working in academia and really got interested in this work and really has been a normative entrepreneur within the UN system around business and human rights, and was the chief author of the Ruggie Principles, or the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. They're soft law. They can't be ratified. They mean nothing in terms of a ratifiable law, but they are shaping action in this domain. And they say three things. They say the state has a duty to protect rights, so that you as an individual have a callable claim on the state to protect your rights from harm in the context of global business activity. And that means that the state has to set up policies and institutions and practices to ensure that non-state actors, including corporations, don't violate your rights, that the corporation itself, and I see a lot of my B school colleagues, are responsible to respect rights, to do so both affirmatively with minimum labor standards and other types of laws in the countries where they're headquartered, but also when they do business elsewhere in global supply chains, and that victims of business have a right to remedy that's jointly to be afforded to them by government and by business. And this thorny piece of what remedy means is a really fascinating part of the literature. Larry Kata-Baker and other colleagues who do a lot more writing in the business school literature are looking at how do we unpack what the corporation's responsibility is. An underexplored part as a political scientist is what government's role is here, and I have a whole nother paper we could talk about if people are interested in Q&A looking at that. There's a really rich literature on norms evolution that I feel this work contributes to. There's also a very rich literature in human rights, on economic rights, and a growing and important body of work in political theory around just responsibility. And then there's an interesting broader political economy literature around incentives for labor rights that I think this work speaks to some extent. And then a scholarly literature in and of itself on business and human rights that spans multiple disciplines that I think this work contributes to. So sometimes I have to show this slide to political scientists when I have to prove that this is really political scientist domain, but I don't worry in an interdisciplinary audience like this. You can all see why it's intrinsically important, but I'm just signaling to you some of the literatures I think it contributes to here. Now let me talk to you a little bit about the mechanics of the book, and then we'll go through some of the things learned, and then I'll go into detail on each of the planks of the book. So it has three sort of different types of levels of analysis and contribution. The first is to trace the historical evolution of this notion of remedy and of stakeholder engagement across multiple eras. And I do this largely with primary source UN documents and with non-governmental organizational historical documents to look at three eras where we would engage stakeholders. In the 80s, primarily as damage control. The Exxon Valdez, the Bhopal incident and spill is primarily a concern around damage control. I will consult the community when there's no other way I can avoid it in the wake of tremendous damage. In the 90s, with the advent of the 24-hour news cycle and new technologies, the idea that we could bring victim testimony into our homes through documentary film, through podcasts, through all sorts of things in the late 90s that enabled us to really begin to understand who these people were as victims. And then in the 2000s, with the emergence of this set of norms around remedy, empowered remedy through multi-stakeholder engagement, driven and animated largely by companies. And at each of those junctures, what this chapter shows, so what in the world is this concept, is that local people's participation is pretty circumscribed, pretty clipped, pretty delimited. And so the first challenge in the book is simply to say, what is this concept? And how do we historicize it? Or what is the genealogy of that notion of stakeholder dialogue? The second piece, which is very quantitative, which I was really fortunate to work with brilliant students on, so to all the undergrads in the room who do research, thank you, maps contemporary dialogues across the globe using 7,000 to 8,000 companies' information that's held in the publicly available database of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. If you have not looked at the Business and Human Resource Center's data, it's state of the art and it's publicly available and it's free and it's wonderful to use. And so my work here I'll talk about, but involved 2 years of coding by hand with students and then the development of an automated programming interface to actually machine code that literature. That's the first incidence of API work with the Business and Human Rights Resource Data Center, and it's spawning a growth industry in the BHR literature that's very exciting. We're going to have a piece coming out in Business and Human Rights Journal about that contribution. And so this is a really important way of using publicly available data to say, if I know what this concept is, where in the world is this kind of consultation happening? In what industries? And then finally, true to my form as a qualitative researcher, is a qualitative set of comparative case studies. So I, as a professor at the University of Connecticut, looked at the 2,500 faculties in UConn's supplier data set and said, let me pick two cases of factories that have impacted development in two communities in the same sector, in the same country, but with two very different corporate approaches to business and human rights. One, which many of you are probably familiar with who read in this literature, the triple living wage factory in the Dominican Republic, Alta, Gracia, and the other, much more conventional Haynes Factory that does conventional minimum wage, but some creative forms of corporate philanthropy and subsidized worker training. And let me see if people at the local level in those communities, not the workers themselves, the 200 lucky people who get the triple wage in the first factory, or the 3,000 people employed in the second factory at conventional wage, not them, because they're interviewed to death. There are multiple books that interview them, but everybody else in the community. How do they view this process of consultation? Do they feel they have a stake in it? Are they even consulted? Do they believe they have a right to be? What do they think about this notion of the norm of remedy? And so this is a study that then allows us to look at not only what is this concept and where is stakeholder engagement happening and where is remedy being meted out, but what do local people, because as a scholar, I'm very interested in grassroots approaches to human rights understanding and norms evolution. What do local people think about that concept? In qualitative evidence as well, I did participant observation at a marvelous conference that we hosted in 2017 at the University of Connecticut on protecting rights at the end of the line and stakeholder engagement. And so we invited our licensing partners, we invited academics, we invited policymakers from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia, and we talked broadly about what are the trends in this domain of stakeholder engagement and why do they matter. And I was able to have IRB approved interviews and participant observation on that site. And I won't go into the website, but we can come back to that at Q&A. And so what do we find when we sort of historicize the concept, when we look globally at mapping it, and then when we take a deep dive at the community level? Well, first of all, that the constraints on stakeholder participation echo those across the decades. It's very difficult to stop long enough in light manufacturing to engage community members. There's an inherent incentive to cut and run and move quickly in light industry, and I'm going to talk about that when I talk about the larger data. But that it's extremely difficult to, at this point, many companies have said it's too difficult to engage those folks. I'm going to talk about some bottom-up worker-driven social responsibility examples that I think are really, really important, but that those constraints hold across the decades. That the patterns of stakeholder consultation are pretty consistent. The phenomenon when we look at those 7,000 to 8,000 companies occurs principally in the extractive sector, where resources are sunk in the ground and the sunk cost is so high that I have to consult with that community. They'll take over the mining site, or they won't allow me into the community. They'll block. The Ogoni people land struggle in Nigeria and elsewhere is kind of paradigmatic for this, right? Ken Saro-Wiwa and others, many people know, I know in the room, because of the prone nature of Shell vis-a-vis that resource in the ground, right? That is not the case in light manufacturing. If I don't like what's happening in the Dominican Republic, I can go quickly to Mexico, or I can container everything and take it across the ocean to Bangladesh, and if I don't like what's happening in Bangladesh, I'll move it very quickly. And so I know all my labor studies colleagues are sort of nodding, because this is the mode. All of us compete on price. I want those socks cheaper. Ian and others who do research will tell you. And so willingness to pay is very low, and the threat of exit is very high. And the 7,000 to 8,000 points of companies' information housed and the 11,000 different points that we derive from that big data set to run these numbers show that very demonstrably. I'm going to show you that later in the drilled down slides. These trends are uniform across regions. There's slightly more consultation happening in Asia, but that's simply because of the preponderance of light manufacturing. But even when I show you another slide, the countries concerned are pretty consistent, and we did both pullouts for individual countries to just be sure that the regional spread was similar, and it's very similar. So that this is very, very noticeable that these patterns are consistent. The nature of prevailing consultation precludes effective engagement of local people in co-constructing remedy, okay? The manner in which we consult. The companies, not communities, typically at the current moment define the fundamental notion of what is appropriate to consult about and what is the nature of harm. And often that harm pivots around a civil and political rights understanding of human rights, not an economic rights one. If I'm egregiously violating your rights by union busting and beating you up for being a unionist, if I am wantonly discriminating against particular individuals, if you're killed in an industrial accident or otherwise, but not if you have a shortfall because you don't earn a living wage. So that even what is appropriate to consult on or what is the nature of harm is typically at the moment being defined by corporations, not by communities, and that companies, not communities, are determining the threshold for how far back is the harm going to be alleged, and that the community's own understanding, and this is really what comes out from the Dominican Republic studies, is very limited at best of what is this notion of business and human rights and what on earth does it have to do with me? I don't work for that company. Why should I have any kind of stake in what it's doing? I'm not lucky enough to work at Alta Gracia, at Alta Gracia. So what stake do I have? Individually subjective socioeconomic status varies across individuals, and intra-community hierarchies are distinct, and so there's some variation in the degree to which people in these two communities think differently. In Alta Gracia, because, as I'm going to show you, of a long-standing engagement with the Workers' Rights Consortium and unions and others, there's a higher level of willingness to engage or learn. In Bonao, where there's a much more conventional factory setting, there's a lot more intermediation between community organizations at the local level and stakeholders. What are the key findings then? That two big rival modes, and this really comes out of our conference in 2017, of consultation for remedy are emerging. One is a very traditional multi-stakeholder engagement model that mirrors an emphasis on, as I said, non-derogable civil and political rights, that's linked to a very conventional understanding of brand risk and value, and that's grounded in a sunk cost. That most of the consultation, remember I told you, is happening in extractives around the worst forms of traditional human rights violations, torture, disappearance, physical harm, rape, and sexual violence, that most of that is being driven because companies are terrified of being spotlighted on 60 Minutes or otherwise hit with flagrant bad press. And that multi-stakeholder engagement, although incredibly important in those spaces, is by no means picking up on this broader notion of economic rights or local community level engagement. And that this alternative path of worker-driven social responsibility, which is very prevalent in places like, for example, the Immokalee workers' struggle in Florida for fair food practices, or the Justice for Janitors campaign, that these are very difficult to scale up and replicate. They take years and years. Even the Triple Living Wage Factory took years of contestation and only employs 200 people, right? And so that this bottom-up approach, while incredibly exciting and important, is very difficult to work with at scale and is very difficult to replicate. And so part of what came out of the conference that we did in 2017 was the reality that on day one we had lots of people who were deeply involved in this important type of top-down consultation and equally involved on the second day in this bottom-up, and that they often go to separate conferences, don't communicate, and are a little mutually dubious about one another. And so for me as a social scientist, watching that interaction was fascinating, because my goal is thinking beyond just a dialogue of the deaf towards how might we more effectively take aspects of both of those types of consultation. And the book employs then this idea in the 6th chapter of a synergy. Might we be able to work past a dialogue of the deaf towards looking at how to use stakeholder dialogue to stabilize these very failure-prone settings, especially in light manufacturing, where the threat of exit looms so high that we're doomed to fail if we keep doing things as we're doing things. Okay, the implications of this book, I would argue in a general sense, and I'd be curious as you guys listen at the end of the talk for your thoughts on this, but I think it helps us fill an important gap that brings the voice of community members beyond workers into this discourse of what we mean by business and human rights. Much of the literature has been driven by analysis of corporate actions and or elite NGOs engagement, but not much has really dealt at this more community-based grassroots level with local perceptions. And so I think as a non-anthropologist, I'm a political scientist, and this was a rapid field study done at scale, but I think it's an important corrective to say that the book showcases local people's perceptions in this business and human rights space, especially around remedy. It expands our overly time-compressed horizon of what we mean by stakeholder dialogue. Some days I feel like Rip Van Winkle, who woke up and John Ruggie appeared, and suddenly we had the bells and whistles of the guiding principles or Ruggie principles, and suddenly we discovered business and human rights. I think we've had lots going on, and many of my venerable colleagues who helped define the field can tell me that, since the 1970s and 80s. And if we can open our historical purview to look, we can see those trends in the 70s, 80s, and 90s over time, and I think that helps us inform what's working and what's not. So it definitely, through this genealogy, expands the time horizon. It's not as though we woke up and had BHR because John Ruggie suddenly started working at the UN. And it reveals the diffuse links between both the state and the corporation as duty bearers in this business and human rights space. Most of the literature has focused on corporate duties. I, as a political scientist, am pushing us to think a little bit more about what's the state's duty as a regulator and an enforcer and an incentive creator. And I'm doing so not only because I think it's important, but because people I interviewed told me, I'm poor, I'm liminal, I'm at best marginal to the concerns of either one of these companies. I don't have a stake per se in what they do with their workers because I don't work for them. But I definitely am concerned about what my government of the Dominican Republic is doing vis-a-vis those companies. And I have an article right now that I'd love to talk to you about in Q&A, but that looks at two-level games that these local people perceive the government is playing. One, incentivizing by driving regulation down businesses to come, and two, at the local level, vis-a-vis corrupt local proxies, meting out jobs and benefits and other things in cahoots with the companies. Not so much via Alta Gracia. This was much more perceived in Bonao vis-a-vis Haynes and other more conventional manufacturing companies. So this idea that stakeholders also want to think through not just the company, but government's responsibility in this space. And corporations themselves, to be fair, in the conversations at our conference, said, I cannot provide all light, power, and well-being for people in the Dominican Republic. It's not my job. Ultimately, you're paying me to make your t-shirts, okay? So I'm happy to be a partner in improving labor conditions in the Dominican Republic, but the government of the DR also has an obligation and a set of obligations. So that's a really interesting part of the conversation that I would love to invite more reflection on, because this is an understudied part of the conversation in BHR as well. What is the government's responsibility? And finally, I take a little bit of a play from colleagues in engineering. I co-teach a class in supply chain assessment for sustainability, social and environmental at UConn with colleagues in engineering, and I've been doing so for 5 years. And that's been a wonderful learning process intellectually for me. Colleagues in engineering talk about inherently failure-prone settings, particularly in computer science and engineering, inherently unstable systems. So how can we look at information derived at the community level as helping us stabilize and improve actions in these incredibly failure-prone settings in the light manufacturing space? And looking at the limits and possibilities of that type of information. Okay. So now what I'm going to do really quickly is go through some of the detail from the 3 aspects of the book. I'm not going to go into the genealogy too much, but I am going to talk about the large N data analysis of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center in just a couple of slides, and then I'm going to talk in 2 slides each about the case studies, okay, each of the towns in the DR. I'll do a summary slide, and then I really don't want to drone on because I would welcome people's conversation and questions. So we're almost 2/3 of the way through the talk. These are the details, and then we'll start our conversation. I would break ordinarily for some questions here, but I know we don't have forever in your tape recording. So I'm going to keep going, and then we'll take the Q&A. So in chapter 3, I think this is important. I know a number of colleagues who work in this business field have done a lot of large N analysis in this space. But this initial double-blind coding of the human rights data set, and I'm sorry, this should say 2018, took 3 years worth. And when you log into the DHRC data, how many people have ever used it? You literally log in and look up an individual company, an individual sector, and you're privy to then all of the information the corporation itself may have chosen to share, all of the information NGOs or monitoring groups share, and any government or other reports that might be archived. It's an extraordinary repository because it's covering individual 7,000 to 8,000 individual companies and multiple data points then across categories. And so I developed coding for my students to do these 3 years of coding and double-blind coded the interface. And we used existing categories from their interface for industry, and we looked at extractives, pharmaceuticals, water, and light manufacturing, and we coded on region and mode also of consultation. So we looked at stakeholder engagement, community level engagement. Another drop-down item was indigenous, and then the word consultation. These were fixed coding terms from within the manner in which the data is managed on the site. And in a second round, then we began to code for issues. So we looked at child labor, living wage, and labor, plus the mode of consultation from above, remember these modes. And then in a third round, we coded on company policies. What were companies doing, if by industry and by issue area, but what was the policy step? Were they taking advancement steps? Were they reporting, et cetera? And these were, again, I'm beholden a bit to the BHRC's coding terms, but we wanted to be able to look across region, across industry, and across types of consultation. And we ran this on a subset of countries because we used a regional dummy, and then we wanted to be sure we weren't finding artifacts, and so we ran on a subset of countries, and we were able to validate that, yes, we were seeing consistent trends. So then we were able to develop this API in May of 2018 in consultation with the BHRC. And we used conjoint analysis of the individual news stories to look at countries, regions, sectors, the principles of consultation, the organizations, and steps. And we used these almost 12,000 units of data across countries, regions, and sectors, and the mechanisms. And we found the same validation of what we had done through hand coding. So it gave me a high level of the credibility of the data, and because it's publicly available at this point, colleagues with much more sophisticated large N analysis capacity at University of Nottingham, Nicole Jans and a team, are now coding upwards of 80,000 units of the DHRC data to do this kind of sophisticated machine coding. And we think it's really important, A, because this is publicly available data, B, because we know it's a repository that allows corporations and citizens groups and other entities to have information placed there, and C, because Ruggie himself instituted it as the place that was the repository for all of his own reporting during his mandate. So we really feel like we want to push the scholarly community to use something free, open, public, and accessible, and to begin to code them in a more sophisticated way. And so I sort of dipped a big toe in the water, but I'm perfectly happy for Nicole to wildly outpace me in her very skilled human rights quantitative scholar manner in using this kind of analysis. I think what it helped us do was say, what is this phenomenon, where is it happening, and then what do local people think? And so what I've been very excited is that the machine and hand coding yielded the same results. We found consultation concentrated, as I said, in extractives by a ratio of 15 to 1 in Africa and by a ratio of 5 to 1 in Asia. And that the complaint mechanism was the dominant form of consultation, rather than free and prior informed consent or impact assessment. That workers on site complaining were the mechanism by which most companies were doing any kind of consultation, and that we weren't consulting with the community to have free, prior, and informed consent before we engaged. And we really weren't doing any kind of engagement with the community on impact assessments. And so by looking at this large mapping exercise, we're able to look at the content of the kind of consultation if it's happening. And that there were key countries within the regions, but also even when we validated that by looking at country subsets in each of the regions. So China, India, Indonesia, and Bangladesh and Asia accounted for well over half of all the consultation in light manufacturing. India, Indonesia, Philippines, and Myanmar in Asia concentrated in the extractives. And so you see certain countries, Indonesia, for example, and India as overlaps. I don't have the time or the resources, the book had to come out, but this opens the way for people then to do individual case studies at the country level. And my hope is that the book is nothing more than an invitation to do more cumulative social scientific research based on these findings. And I think Jan's and her team definitely are moving in that direction with this larger data set. I can come back to the graph, but this is just a really nice little pull-out of one of the tables from the book that lets you look at the preponderance in the extractives versus light industry and almost nothing happening in pharmaceuticals or water. What's really interesting when you move beyond this is that I then do in this chapter an analysis of the existing BHR literature that's been large N, and Shift, which is John Ruggie's own NGO based in New York City, he helped found it, did an analysis of 43 companies and found the same types of trends. The OECD Watch, another large research NGO, looked at 250 companies in 2015. MSI Integrity, which Tyler Giannini and colleagues at Harvard helped start, it's a nonprofit organization, does similar kind of research, 45 companies, a deep dive. These are much smaller samples, but all of them are finding things on the similar nature of the consultation process.
MSI Integrity actually does research on multi-stakeholder initiatives.
Yeah, but they're doing it multi-stakeholder initiatives, and so they're looking, and what I would love to have somebody do is start looking at the individual companies where the MSIs are happening. So they're doing it exactly with MSI as the consultative mechanisms themselves. Thank you for catching that. And what I think is really important is that they're finding the same qualitative kinds of findings on the nature of the consultation process. And I thought it was really important to juxtapose what we were looking at with the DHRC data with what are the other best practice kinds of research endeavors that are happening in the field. And so this helped me because what I'm finding is then similar to the types of patterns being found by other researchers. So I'm going to jump from all that large N data and would love to have people come back and ask questions, but now I want to look really quickly at the two case studies. And as a researcher, this is the area that is most aligned with my own prior work in community development and research in a more general sense in my first book and in other research I do. I want to just point out for people who might not be familiar with the Dominican Republic, but this is Santo Domingo, the Alta Gracia is here, and Bonao is here. These are within an hour and 25 minutes, half an hour, 45 minutes or so to the Alta Gracia without too bad a level of traffic, and a little over an hour to Bonao. And this is the industrial spine of the Dominican Republic, Highway 1. Very, very heavy presence of industry. It's not surprising that the engagement with the Alta Gracia factory is happening in the Alta Gracia because it's extremely easy to get to and to work with. Many, many student groups go. I was certainly not the first person to go visit the Alta Gracia. What's interesting is that the town, the state of San Cristobal, where this factory happens, has forged this reputation as a manufacturing site, but the worker-driven social responsibility characteristic of the Alta Gracia factory is a very central aspect of why I wanted to look at this particular case. There are roughly 84,000 inhabitants in the Alta Gracia, in the town of Alta Gracia. The company employs, as I mentioned earlier, only 200 people. So a goal for us at UConn is, can we source, for example, the blank t-shirts that get embellished, which are pretty simple to make at volume, and can we encourage other collegiate apparel procurement of blanks from Alta Gracia? Because Alta Gracia is paying, remember, 3 times the minimum wage. At 83 cents an hour is the Dominican wage. The Alta Gracia is paying $2.83 an hour. And that translates into very significant development gains for workers. But remember, I'm interviewing everybody else. Active both union presence on site and an on-site satellite office of the Workers' Rights Consortium within the factory has meant that this is a very classic workers-driven social responsibility model, co-construction of the monitoring standards, the payment scale, even the determination of what the living wage was very intermediated between NGOs, labor unions, and the local population. And so this is a very unique model, but remember, the challenge for the NWSR model is replicability and scalability. It's only employing 200 people. It struggles to have enough consistency. It manufactures, remember, explicitly for the apparel market, but it's really preponderant in the collegiate space. The hang tag you saw on that first slide, "My son goes to school because I make these clothes," is one of its marketing artifacts. It really is marketing to the collegiate apparel sector. And remember, I'm trying to discern what folks beyond those 200 workers think about this notion of remedy, or think about this notion of business and human rights and social responsibility. Bonao, just so you have a sense, is almost double the size, not quite, but it's 125,000 inhabitants. It's in the adjacent state, Monsieur Noel, about 40 kilometers away from Alta Gracia. Haynes is the dominant apparel procurement factory in that site. It employs 3,000 workers, and this is one of about 6 plants that have been in the DR for 30 years, working on a 24/7 production schedule, much higher end manufacturing. It's principally blanks, but it's textiles for much beyond collegiate apparel, right? We're only a portion of that larger production for that factory. It pays a conventional minimum wage. It does both subsidized worker training in relation with the Ministry of Labor. You can earn your GED or do other forms of training paid for by the factory. That relationship has been researched really extensively by Andrew Schrank, a sociologist at Yale University, who's done a lot of work looking at that partnership between business and the Ministry of Labor and worker training. And then it does much more traditional corporate philanthropy. The bus you saw in the first picture with a lot of people standing outside of it and Haynes on the bus is a bus that goes around and screens children for eye, ear, nose, and throat operations, and then it works with Wake Baptist Children's Hospital in the headquarters town where the company is located in the United States and the Carolinas on bringing a small number of kids every year for ear, nose, and throat surgeries and developing the capacity of local hospital staff there to do screening and training. So it's a very, very different type of model. It's innovative in its own sense. It's touching a broader range of people, but at that conventional 83 cents an hour. Now, that's not uniform across all workers, because as workers move up the seniority scale or take greater supervisory roles or work additional overtime, they might earn more, but it is not a living wage factory. Okay, so I'm looking again, remember, at population in both communities. I did research in Bonao in a very low-income neighborhood to try to make it more comparable to the Alta Gracia setting. Las Delicias is the interview site, relatively poor site within Bonao. Okay. What do we learn? In the first town, there's a very widespread lack of information at the local level, despite the high-profile nature of the Alta Gracia factory, about company practices or stakeholder dialogue. Most people, even though they knew it was a great thing if you got one of those 200 jobs, really didn't have a sense of what business and human rights meant or what right they had, if any, to engage in dialogue with the company. Most of the non-workers didn't view stakeholder consultation as something they had a right to take part in. So that's paradoxical in a place that has this legacy of worker-driven social responsibility, nor did they expect companies or unions to owe them anything, since they didn't work for the firm. They did, however, believe that they had citizenship rights, and they wouldn't be all that predisposed to consult if it didn't, in their busy lives as poor folks, seem to have any meaningful benefit to them. So they didn't want to just be consulted for token sense as a consultation. They were very pragmatic. They weren't ostensibly hostile to this process, but quite pragmatic. They had very creative ideas of how consultation could, in theory, engage them. But in Alta Gracia, I would argue, looking at the data, the citizenship rights piece trumped anything. Alta Gracia is the singularly most violent town in the Dominican Republic. It has an incredibly high crime rate. Every single day, there's a power outage of a minimum of 2 hours. It generally occurs during the evening hours, and that has led to the propensity for violence in the community at an extraordinarily high level. And so people were concerned about government corruption and effectiveness of both access to power and water. Water goes out quite frequently with a very bad piping system, and so people's concerns were really around government as the purveyor of responsibility to hold broader actors in the corporate sector accountable, but to provide basic infrastructure, et cetera. Really interesting. And not an overt hostility to stakeholder engagement, but sort of a notion that I don't have a lot of time unless I can be sure that there's a real benefit for it. Juxtaposed with Bonao, here the idea of a living wage, which people in the Alta Gracia were aware of because of the presence of the Alta Gracia factory, hadn't even circulated 40 kilometers up the road. When I would say, oh, I'm doing this research in Alta Gracia, ¿Y por qué? Why did you go there? Oh, because this is the living wage factory. What is a living wage? What are you talking about? So it really hadn't circulated. And that the Quinta de Vecinos, the neighborhood associations in Bonao, played a big gatekeeping role, mediating interaction between Haynes and people at the local level, acting as job brokers, basically. And for all my people who do social science or social work or community development, this was a really crucial role. It's the second game I talked about in the article I'm working on that's played with vis-a-vis corporations and local people as brokers, local political actors, local level strong people in the neighborhoods really were acting as brokers. And there's a lot of ethnographic detail in the book about people's perceptions of how you get a job at Haynes. You get a job at Haynes if you're buddy-buddy with the people in the Quinta de Vecinos and not based on your own smarts or capacity. Much less internalized idea, they've internalized the idea of needs assessment and priority setting in both of these communities, in part because Peace Corps workers have gone there in great numbers, to Bonao, for example. But in Bonao, much less expansive notions of alternatives of what the realm of the possible might be, because they had no example of a worker-driven social responsibility model to draw on than people in Alta Gracia would. Especially in Bonao, people viewed any kind of consultation as a zero-sum game because of this intermediation for job access. There was this view that if I consult, I might become privy to information, and that will enrich me, but there wasn't much solidarity about consultation. And quite significantly in Bonao compared to Alta Gracia, pretty significant gender disparities, both in terms of the types of training that women would take through the jobs training on site, with more men going into skilled occupations and leaving the Bonao factory of Haynes skilled to become an electrician or something, and women doing courses in mediation and conflict resolution, but without meaningful employment impact. And then also, the union leaders in Alta Gracia have included many women in the Alta Gracia Corporation, and that was not the case in Bonao, a much more conventional male-dominated union structure. Unionization rates in the DR, I should just say, by way of bracketing, are very, very low compared even to the rest of Latin America. Community members in both places, as I've mentioned, had very creative ideas. One of the most creative ideas, and I just talked about it with Kio's class to come out of Bonao actually, was a community member who said, I am so tired. Every year Haynes brings backpacks. I know that they get all these backpacks and they want to give them to kids, but my kid has like 3 backpacks. I would be so much more interested if they would engage in developing solar panels on their factory so that when the power grid goes down, because in Alta Gracia and in Bonao the power goes down 2 hours a day. In Bonao, the city powers that be have synchronized it so that on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, it's off from 11 to 1, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays, it's off from 3 to 5. It's not an evening power shutdown as in Beata Gracia, but it's a power shutdown. And so the diesel-powered generators provoke terrible air quality. This person said if they could just load share with us on solar panels, put them up, then they wouldn't be running this massive numbers of generators. We could load share on the community center. Everybody would benefit. Our kids could go someplace to do homework during those hours. Everybody plans their days around these power outages. Why not have a mutually beneficial solution instead of yet more backpacks? And so that kind of level of creativity in this highly failure-prone setting is something that you're simply not going to pick up if you talk about multi-stakeholder engagement from on high. And I would argue that that's one of the most exciting aspects of this kind of research, that we come up with extraordinarily good ideas when we learn to listen and to engage. So the policy implications in the 6th chapter of the book, which are derived both from the large N and from the case studies, and then from this really interesting participant observation at our 2017 conference, are first of all that we really need new strategies for engaging government as a party responsible for a remedy. The DR is one of the most clientelistic sites in Latin America. And so there may be an artifact of the fact that I did the case studies in a place that is highly, highly clientelistic. And in the corruption perception index in the world, very, very corrupt. And the time at which I was surveying the it's Movimiento Marcha Verde, the green movement of their country was protesting against heavy, heavy level of political influence and corruption in government contracting vis-a-vis international multinational construction companies. So there was a high sensitivity around corruption anyway, but the idea that government should be more meaningfully engaged as a partner in the BHR space really was resonant. That we need new mechanisms for extending this right to participation beyond workers themselves. Worker-driven social responsibility models in places like Immokalee and other places have tended to involve community members more centrally, and that we really need new forms of remedy, including collective goods provisioning that involve both government and corporations. So should Haynes provide the entire power grid? No. For the Dominican Republic, that is the job of the government. But how do we create incentives to ensure that there is better public goods provisioning through this lens of business and human rights? And then finally, a real recognition in my research of the interdependence of rights. If much of the top-down MSI consultation we have is happening around the most egregious forms of labor rights violation or the most egregious forms of pollution and toxicity, then we're missing the boat on this broader realm of economic rights that is really consequential. And we as consumers can directly impact that with our willingness to pay more for ethically sourced product. I, again, use this decision-making under uncertainty and failure-prone settings, this notion from, I credit my colleague Krishna Padapati at UConn in engineering for this idea, but then to apply it here, that diagnostically we can assess what's happened and why, if we can engage communities better, predictively what could happen or what's the realm of the possible, and how can we approximate solutions incrementally over time. We're not going to change stakeholder engagement overnight, but how might we incrementally begin to think differently? And so this final chapter really is trying to get us beyond just being hopelessly paralyzed by the state of stakeholder consultation towards a much more dynamic notion of what is possible. And so with that, I will take questions and be happy to go back on any slides.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was remiss in not thanking the President of the Advisory Committee on Labor Standards and Human Rights for co-sponsoring this talk. Okay? Thank you. The chair of the committee is here, Ravi. And now we have 10, 20 minutes for questions.
And Brenna has the mic, so don't be shy.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you so much for
And
giving
thank
this talk.
you.
This is really exciting. So you were sort of skeptical of the multi-stakeholder approach at a number of points during the talk, and I'm interested to know so do you think there's any hope at all for multi-stakeholder
So this
initiatives,
is a
especially
great-
ones that have been very, very heavily criticized and developed by a variety of different actors like RSPO or like RSB?
So she's
is
saying
there
like
any hope at all?
Responsible Palm Oil Initiative or others. So I have to say, as somebody pragmatically involved, and Ravi, I feel your pain, with our committee, the counterpart committee, we have invested massive amounts of money in political credibility over, I've been at UConn 15 years, and I've been on that president's committee ever since the first semester, the end of the first semester I was there. We are members of the Fair Labor Association. We are members of the Workers' Rights Consortium. A portion of every single item licensed at UConn goes to support those MSIs. I cannot in good conscience say, no, tomorrow all we're going to do is worker-driven social responsibility, because I cannot go to every community and invest in the development of capacity at the local level to create another Alta Gracia factory. And so my approximating solutions and my 6th chapter that's this desperate attempt at a synthesis may piss people off on both sides of the fence, but my hope is honestly, really, that we can harness the energy and the resources that are already being spent in multi-stakeholder engagement and begin to add nuance and meaningful credibility to those processes by radically departing from business as usual, by engaging some of these local stakeholders in a much more meaningful way, and by engaging our consumer population. We have a wonderful resource in our student population to push. Consumers themselves have to be willing to pay more and have to demonstrably demand that companies are able to credibly attest to the investment in those kinds of strategies. So I am not willing to completely throw away MSIs as critical as I've been, because I know what the sunk cost is in those types of programs. And I know that because I looked at collegiate licensing, we are heavily invested in those existing alternative frameworks. And we are not as heavily invested in the work you're doing at Michigan around fair food sourcing and other things, is forcing us to have to look differently and think about some of this worker-driven responsibility. But it's going to take time to replicate and scale up those initiatives. A great question. Other questions, other thoughts? Don't be shy.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. This feels so official with this
Thank
mic.
you.
So I was really interested in La Junta de Vecinos.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, I think you talked a little bit about unions, but I don't think that's the norm usually for workers. Right. And so I wonder sort of what other creative ideas beyond maybe La Junta de Vecinos would help create some leverage for a community or for a group of workers who may otherwise not have anything.
Right. So Junta de Vecinos is a really interesting concept, and I have some of the original primary source data from the government of the Dominican Republic, who had a big World Bank grant to just get a handle on how many NGOs are there in this country, how many are registered with the government versus how many are operating at the grassroots level completely under the radar. And one of the things you see is the less formalized groups may be a source of immediate support to the community, but are not able to tap into international funds or government support in any other meaningful way. And so juntas, while they fill a really important social coordination role, are themselves a blessing and a curse. They're an opportunity for many people to professionalize themselves by being part and parcel of the junta. They multiply people's voices and create a sense of solidarity in a really important way. But they can also become victims of their own success as opportunity hoarders. And so Chuck Tilley, very famous sociologist, developed this idea of opportunity hoarding. How did the Irish cops in Boston become Irish cops? They only posted the notices about recruitment in the union halls of Catholic Irish parishes. They didn't post them publicly. They only let other Irish people know, and that's how you ended up with Irish cops in Boston. So Junta de Vecinos are great, participatory and inventive, and in many instances they are the only way people can collectively complain about things like lack of water, lack of power, police violence, etc. But without being very careful, we have to also think through how to enable them not to become a zero-sum opportunity hoarding type of vehicle. And in Bonao, with 3,000 jobs, mediated, literally people would say the lista comes down from the Junta de Vecinos, from Haynes. We have 15 jobs available. Bring me a list of 30 people, I'll interview and find 15. Who do you think those 15 people are? They're not on the bad side of the dueña de la Junta de Vecinos. The owner is what people would call it. The dueña, the owner. No, you don't own the junta. The junta is a collective vehicle. So I think I'm very optimistic about what possible solidarist vehicle a junta that can be. But sadly, I'm also mindful in settings of scarcity of the deep politicization that the junta can also enact. And there's a marvelous academic at University of Alabama, Anne-Marie Shoop, who has done some extraordinary CHOUP work at the community level, looking at needs and demands functions through juntas in the DR. And she's done tremendous work, so I would commend her work to you. Anne-Marie Shoop, superb. Yeah. right down here.
Thank you again for being
Thank
here.
you.
I'm really interested, as an MBA student myself, looking at the role of corporations in this whole piece, and obviously it being really difficult to drive those incentives. And I'm wondering if in any of your research you've looked at some positive ways that organizations have been able to build a framework around how they do engagement at that earlier project planning level, or if any of the data analysis there came back an earlier type of intervention that showed any types of patterns in particular.
So one thing that's really interesting, and I don't know how many people have read Adler Milstein and Klein's book Sowing Hope, and it's at the very beginning of my slides, and I have to get all the way back there. But that is an ethnography by a former member of the Workers' Rights Consortium who explains how the factory was set up in Alta Gracia. And it's not traditional social science. And as a social scientist, I have to tell you, there's no IRB, everybody's name is named, people's pictures are in the book. I couldn't believe it got published by a university press. But it's really important because what it gives you is a sense of how difficult it was to set up that factory. And one of the examples that was fascinating in that, and I'm working on it in the current paper, I'm just trying to get back so I can show you this book. Sorry, this will take just a minute. There we go. Sorry, I wish I had a better way of going. So this is the book, Sowing Hope. They go through extraordinary detail on this recruitment process. In the DR, the Quinta de Vecinos in Morão, for example, the 15-job example, is totally conventional. And local political actors will say, I got those jobs to come here. I brought those jobs. I'm the broker of those jobs. I'm in bed with this politician, and that's why those jobs came here. And so there's this influence trading that's happening at multiple levels in a highly clientelistic and corrupt system. People literally would say to me, if the president would wake up, we would have jobs in this town. He would bring jobs here. He would make the factories come. And so what was very interesting in this example, and Adler Milstein and Klein talk about this in great detail, is when the factory was being set up, the WRC and workers and members of the union did an open hiring process where you had public lists of people who were being vetted for the jobs, and you had interviewing on site in public view. And visibly pregnant workers, because pregnancy screening of workers, and I've written about this in my first book in 2006, is a pernicious problem throughout Latin America. You're screened out of the labor force if you're pregnant because on the books there's paid maternity leave. So visibly present workers, pregnant workers, were allowed to be in the interview pool, which people were stunned by. And so for this book, which is much more of a sort of personal history, it's not a traditional social science book at all, but it would be very interesting for you to read about the recruitment process for those prized 200 jobs. This factory also was set up with a very participatory process to determine what a living wage in the Dominican Republic would be. And there are plenty of other research organizations that are doing living wage studies. And for the FLA and the WRC, Robbie can talk about this in great detail. You can jump in at any point. But this remains a challenge. Many of our codes of conduct say we want to pay a living wage, but the living wage varies across places. And so this particular book lets you look in depth at how that living wage was determined with the WRC and individual workers acting as intermediaries at the local level. How much does food cost? How much does bus fare cost? How much is the average for housing? What would I have to earn? And that $2.83 versus 83 cents an hour redounds to pennies on the dollar change in the cost of my husky dog shirt, really. And I think when we did surveying in 2006, 8, and 9, I did this with Lyle Scruggs and a team of colleagues at nationally representative telephone surveys, 1,400 person sample, looking at changes in willingness to pay. Many consumers told us, and this is based on Ian's work and others, I would pay more if I knew that the money was credibly going to go to somebody at the end of the production line. I wasn't going to get sucked up in, retail central or in the pockets of the CEO. And so there is this gap between the credence attribute of this being a fair trade garment and the vehicle for getting that money to the worker themselves. And so the really interesting contribution that Adler, Milstein, and Klein make is peeling back the layers of the onions in this example of the 200-person factory to show you how complex it would be to hire and to determine what a living wage would be. And I think as an MBA student, if we began to think through what does it mean to collect that kind of data about living wage, it's a tremendously complex job where local people's knowledge then becomes really, really important. Yeah, that's That's a great question. Let's see.
Yeah, I wanted to go back, thank you
Yeah.
for
thank
the
you.
presentation and for
Thank you.
also your responses in the Q&A. They've helped expand this. I wanted to go back to the field research that you did in the two communities and the whole exploration about the consultations and the comment that you made that from the data that the most prevalent kind of consultation format was complaint mechanism,
Yeah.
et cetera. So I've been thinking a lot about the consultations that have taken place around the Sustainable Development Goals, that whole period. Prior to that, the World Bank's efforts to have the poverty reduction
Yeah.
strategies, which were very and neither of those have been, well, maybe the Sustainable Development Goals better than the World
Yeah.
Bank experiment. But the question for you is, you didn't find what you hoped either. It's very
Yeah.
clear you were a little
Yeah.
disappointed that there was not the connection between the companies and the broader community. What did you hope to find? What would that have looked like?
Yeah.
Can you give us a vision of what you think would be the robust manifestation of the business and human rights model in these villages?
That's a great question. And I didn't go in with any preconceived notion about kind of what I might find. I definitely went in wondering if people understood what remedy was, because the norm that I was trying to trace the evolution of was this notion of remedy. And I knew, based on the large N data analysis, that the extractive sector was having to provide remedy when it killed people in the course of problems within mine and extractive work, or when there was demonstrable harm, as in the case of the Porgera example in Indonesia, of rapes of women on the sites of mining sites. But I didn't know really what to expect. I knew that there was immense amount of research going on around the Alta Gracia factory, and I knew that there was a lot of attention being paid to the workers. And I myself am guilty of interviewing workers to death. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of workers in my life, but I had not anticipated this role of the Quinta de Vecinos, for example. I totally underestimated that. And I had not really been ready to grapple with how manifestly corrupt people viewed local politicians as being. I've lived in a lot of places in the world, a lot of different developing countries, but the DR is unique in the level of perceived patronage and clientelism. So I think one piece that is still stumping me is, if I'm going to tell corporations you need to engage with the community, they need to hire more people like the students who are coming out of your program with interdisciplinary skills and field skills, because you can't know who the community is if you sit in Manhattan and plan a consultation. And the only way you'll know is through credible brokers. The problem is people perceive the junta as the only credible broker. And so part of that challenge may just be building capacity in civil society to be able to articulate one's own needs and interests. And that's a much bigger development challenge, I think. But I've been really intrigued by companies that have been willing. I think Haynes had some pretty interesting intent in working both with the Dominican Ministry of Labor around provision of skills. Now granted, it gets a tax write-off and it decreases its burden tax-wise by investing in this kind of strategy, but I've said to people, Haynes is sort of approximating doing the right thing, building the capacity of people in a very poorly funded regional hospital to do diagnosis. And so ironically, as problematic as Haynes can be, it's groping like the big elephant in the room. I have a tail, you have the trunk, somebody else has the ear. It has also embedded in its headquarters a Dominican national who's the person who manages all of those relationships, and it employs a person in the factory who's a social worker, or really essentially a social worker, who coordinates any of this medical outreach work it does once the families are identified. And that's a very different kind of model, right? Where you have a social work person in the factory and you have somebody who's the DR national helping think through the philanthropy. It's imperfect. But I think one of the fascinating results for me of our 2-day consultation, where we brought people from the WSR community, worker-driven social responsibility, and the MSI world, was that those people often never got in the same room. And the end of the first day, I have to tell you, just truth in advertising, one of the WSR people said, "Why the heck did you bring me here? What am I, like the window dressing? If those guys have all the money and all the power, then MSI stuff is going to be what trumps." By the end of the second day, she was totally okay. She realized, okay, now I have a chance to speak about what this other alternative approach is. But the hostility and the mutual hostility, the MSI people were sure they were just going to be called out and shamed and named and blamed. And so what it made me realize was how much within this BHR universe of mutual misunderstanding there is, and how we desperately need people who have a commitment to grassroots level understandings of human rights and the complexities and aren't just going to give up. Because giving up and saying, well, it's all corrupt, I can't make any difference, I'll just give everybody backpacks and go home at the end of the day. So my hope is that I would love it if corporations valued enough this type of local engagement that there was a real interest in getting non-corporate line reporting staff in the traditional legal and or quality assurance function of the company to work in this interplay between government and civil society. And I think it takes a very different kind of practitioner to be willing to do that. So it's a new space, but I think that the case studies, I had no expectation really going in about how complicated Bonao would be as a site, because nobody's researched Haynes. Nobody. There's no academic literature. There's a book on the WSR model in the Alta Gracia, and there are a number of articles on the Alta Gracia, but nobody's researched Haynes. Absolutely nothing. If you went and did a Scholar One search or anything else, you just wouldn't find anything. And so I kind of am trying to grapple with how to change the way we do research on human rights to get more of this ethnographic detail, but that's also in dialogue with the large end trends. And that's hard too, because a lot of the work has been case specific, case study, factory specific. And so I think we need to be thinking about how to get those kinds of experts, but to how to create a space within the BHR universe for actors with that skill set who are willing to engage. So it's pretty challenging. I don't think we have the right mix of people in the room necessarily to know how to construct, and each community is going to be different. These are two communities in the DR literally 40 kilometers apart with such different challenges and problems. But I think the book is giving voice to the need for this type of research and hopefully that type of professional training. I think I love talking to students because they'll say, wow, I never thought about using my human rights work that way. So hopefully. Great question. Other thoughts? Oh, wait, and then there.
So I'm an MBA student as well. So
Okay.
One of the things that I think about a lot is how do we incentivize doing the right thing? And you mentioned a few things like tax write-offs and that kind of stuff. So I'm also curious if you've seen any incentive systems be particularly effective.
Yeah. I think for certainly in the Alta Gracia factories case, what's been incredibly interesting is right now, if you looked at your tag, and we were talking about this today in the committee's meeting, all you would see on the tag of your shirt is fiber content, washing instructions, and point of origin. There is no way under FDA standards that you could know anything about the labor conditions under which it's made. So Alta Gracia's little hang tag, the picture of the guy, is a credence attribute. Now that's not extant in most of the rest of the industry, but there's a real investment in this part of the collegiate market to say, this is how I want to make the product. And that factory is struggling to have enough volume to stay afloat. And so part of what my institution has done is just said we're going to source all our blanks there. And we're going to push the rest of the collegiate sector because collectively we're only 2 or 3% of the global apparel market, but we're very high profile. And we have a group of students who, if we cultivate this type of engagement, will go out as educated consumers. And so I think that that's a really interesting example of how, in the absence of a regulatory set of incentives, the market-based incentive is saying, and our survey work that Ian was really helpful with, 06, 08, 09, showed us there's a gap in willingness to pay because people don't trust, they can't find the product, right? How do I know what a fair trade coffee is really, or how do I know what sweat-free apparel is? And then if I can't find it, even if I found it, how would I be sure if I paid more, it doesn't just go to Madison Avenue, it actually goes to the community? And how can I be sure that the community beyond that worker would benefit? Edler, Milstein, and Klein kind of argued that there's a carry-on, trickle-down effect. Average people in the community said it's not trickling very far. I would like to have those solar panels because I'm not sure it's going to trickle very far. So I think that that's one of the mechanisms really is filling this niche, market niche, for more credible information.
So do you feel then that it has to happen on the consumer side?
I think that that's a really important piece of the puzzle. Yeah, really important. I think 1 and 2.
Hi.
Hi.
That was a very interesting presentation. I used to hear about Alta Gracia quite a bit when it was starting up because I was involved in the university committee at the time. But the idea was that the setup there might spawn other similar things. And I haven't heard much about it. I was wondering whether there's been any of that. And I was also wondering whether the things you said about the town and the high crime rate and all this, were you saying that, did that have anything to do with Alta Gracia?
No, it predates Alta Gracia.
I was wondering, has there been any kind of contagion effect?
No, and that was what I was saying, like 40 kilometers away in another collegiate apparel manufacturing town, people hadn't even heard of. And I can say to you anecdotally that government people and others were unaware of this model. They just, it really was so outwardly oriented to us that this is somewhat of a response to Susan's question. If you were able to cultivate in the local community the sense that this is also your investment in changing the structure of the way we engage with companies, that would be wonderful. But the community capacity, people's tiredness, the bandwidth, all of those other things that are going on have militated against that. And just keeping that factory open has been tremendously difficult. It's gone through, since you were on the committee, it's gone through 2 different ownership structures. Because Joe Bozich sold it to Haynes, who didn't spin that model out beyond that factory. And it's been really difficult to keep it open because it has to rely on steady production orders, and most of the rest of collegiate apparel isn't being made there. And so the blanks, and it doesn't have the level of sophistication as a factory that other 24/7 large spinning mills would have. And so just making really sophisticated garments quality-wise wasn't possible. And so the solution may be blanks, just having it make the blanks, but that we would all collectively source the blanks. I think gaining the studies that John Klein has done at Georgetown of Alta Gracia as a business entity, because he's a business school professor, has just been that it doesn't have enough both quality and long-term commitment in purchasing orders. And so part of what we're trying to do, UConn and some other colleagues within the FLA and elsewhere, is to develop a credible market commitment to blanks that you could sustain over time, because the model has been really difficult. And I think a lot of students just don't understand the potential impact that purchase could have, and I think it's also been very difficult in the highly competitive, boutiqueized university bookstores getting floor space for Alta Gracia and getting proper signage and helping create consumer demand for it.
Two other questions.
Yeah.
One, this is related to how people find jobs in the other factory.
In Bonao, yeah.
And so it seems like it would be multiplied in terms of corruption for getting a job in Alta Gracia.
No, it's interesting because they were so, and this is my point to you about reading the case study, they were very, very careful. Corrupt local politicians kept saying, we brought Alta Gracia here. And so the Alta Gracia workers and WRC and everybody else would say, no, you didn't. And they would challenge very openly on the radio and all sorts of things because there was this attempt at co-optation of the narrative by local political actors. Yeah.
The other question is, how much does the higher pay rate at that level translate into a differential for blanks? I mean, does it make it 10% more expensive?
That I don't know, and I can try to find that out for you, but I think the finished garment, like embellished, et cetera, at the beginning was, I can't remember, but like 25 to 50 cents more per item at max. Blanks would probably even be cheaper because the blank is requiring far less operator time, right? And it's a lower quality standard overall. So I think you could compete on price much better on blanks for Alta Gracia. And that's what certainly our Director of Trademark Licensing has been really, and he's a member of the FLA board and he's very involved in the WRC's working living wage monitoring group. So we're really trying very hard to think about how to create a business argument for that model, but also a social argument for that model. Yeah, I think there was one more question.
Maybe one last quick question, if there's.
Thank you very much for your insight on a lot of these issues. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the distinction between extractive industries and the sweatshop industries. And I'm thinking about the impact of those industries on communities, and that could explain why communities will react differently to some of these issues. For example, visibility of environmental damage.
Exactly.
Could be the reason why a lot of community engagement might be present in extractive industries. But I wonder what the impact will be on that.
Yeah, we should co-author an article because one of the really interesting things about Bonao is that Monsieur Noel is next to a province where extractives are very prevalent in the Dominican Republic, and the edge of Monsieur Noel as a province has extractive work. And fascinatingly, in the interviews with people in Bonao, the example they used for corporate responsibility was, man, if you pollute a river, if you mess up and spoil the environment, you are accountable to all of us. And they would talk about people having had larger social mobilization vis-a-vis extractive companies. So they themselves felt like, I can't do it in the cut and run light manufacturing, but they were very concerned about the environmental damage. And the examples were fascinating. People would talk about the floriculture industry in that province is also quite high, and that those mining operations are killing the flowers because of acid rain, essentially. And so they're not only doing damage to the natural environment, and it intrinsically is problematic, but they're now impinging on other people's livelihood. And so I had a colleague who said to me, be very careful, maybe you've cross-contaminated your sample, because now there are all these people who are dealing with extractives, but these were not people employed by the extractive sector. What was interesting, though, is that the Quinta de Vecinos role for job recruitment, they said, happened the same way with the extractive sector. That these juntas for Barrick Gold and others would get a list, and they would say there are 15 names, and it would all go to the friends and relatives of people. So that even in the extractive sector, this preferential hiring practice was happening through the juntas as well. So that's really interesting, right? That even though it's a sunk cost and even though it's a less mobile industry, that this intermediation role in a clientelistic setting was also present. But you're very right that the larger environmental impact it created a sense of agency and shared fate for people who were willing to have sit-ins and protests, et cetera. And it shaped their idea of corporate remedy because they felt very strongly that if the corporation actively despoiled the environment, it had an obligation. And interestingly, even in Alta Gracia, I did interview one woman who worked, and I actually stayed in her home, and she worked for Alta Gracia, but she was incredibly knowledgeable and talked about the floriculture industry in her community, having been in her province, having been impacted by serious pollution, and that the industry itself, export-oriented agriculture, had itself pernicious impact on the environment. So this environmental notion of corporate responsibility, whether in export agriculture or extractives, was really present for people and really created a sense of immediacy to corporate responsibility for remedy, and really created a potential, I think, for larger collective action, which was really interesting.
Great, wonderful.
Yeah,
Please join
thank
me
you.
in thanking Professor Hertel
Thanks
for
all
her
of you
wonderful
for such great
presentation.
questions.